few more coming in. We'll let them get seated and then pray. And thank our Heavenly Father for this beautiful day and for every open door into every open heart. And thank Him for every chance to edify ourselves and to glorify Him. In Jesus' name, amen. We have a silence group in the afternoon, of which you have heard. And one of the questions about silence seems to be, isn't it rather dangerous to go into the silence? And the answer is, why, of course it is. It's always dangerous to get close to reality. Dangerous to the old self, but wonderfully good for the new. It was very dangerous to discover electricity. But we've made some good uses of it, along with the electric chair and everything. It's dangerous to discover atomic energy, but it seems to have a pretty good future if we use it correctly. Yes, the silence is very dangerous because God is in the silence. And wherever God is, Satan is. God never appears except Satan appears with him. And he tries to set up a conflict, and often does. But nevertheless, even though silence is perhaps the most destructive thing in the universe, it is at the same time the most redemptive thing. It achieves the greatest bad and it achieves the greatest good. It's a complete contrast. It all depends upon where your attention is when you're in the silence as to what it's going to do. God was not found in the storm, says the Old Testament. He was not found in the fire and the earthquake. He was found in the voice of gentle stillness, as one translation puts it. Silence is God. No ideas of ours or opinions of ours about God is worthy of him. For no ideas or notions of ours about God can anywhere near describe God. But I think the best description that I have of God is silence. He is completely still. And the best demonstration I've ever seen of that stillness was Jesus standing before Pilate. And Pilate was the judge, had the authority of Rome behind him to approve or disapprove what he said, to set him free or to turn him over to the crucifiers. And all in the world Jesus had to do was just to say a few words in self-defense. And Pilate would have turned him loose, but he said never a word. He was God standing there, demonstrating the power of God, which is silence. Now, it's the misuse of silence that destroys everybody. No one is destroyed on earth except through silence. Nations are not destroyed except through silence. All destructive influences are silently entertained, either collectively by nations or by individuals. And there is actually no working out of salvation from within except by entering into the great silent spaces within us. We can receive a spiritual experience by an invasion of the grace of God into our lives. And we can have our lives pretty well shattered and turned upside down. But then comes the commandment to work out your salvation from within. It's got to come from the within to the without. And that is discipline. And the greatest discipline in the world, of course, is the discipline of being still. The tongue is an unruly member. It is always full of exercise, and consequently it never gets arthritis. No one ever heard of anybody getting arthritis of the tongue. And possibly the most silent member of the human body is the most healthy. There's one member in the human body that I've never heard of anyone having sickness in that particular member. It never speaks. It never does anything. It never seems to achieve anything. It has no ambition. But women adore it, and men ought to adore it. It's the lobe of the ear. It gets the least attention, is therefore the healthiest. I doubt if it's ever been sick. Now the women do wonderful things for that lobe. They really adore it and adorn it. And I have suggested from time to time that men ought to do that. I suggested that in Montana, and men ought to wear earrings, and Marcia Brown offered me a beautiful pair. It never speaks. It never has to defend itself because there isn't anything there to defend. It's the silent member, and I presume the most highly honored among all the members of the body by God. Yes, silence is tremendous, both to kill and to cure. Doctors don't heal anybody, and none of them will tell you that they ever heal anybody. People are healed by silence. There is no creature in nature that ever has any healing except by silence. God heals them by silence. They simply go off and get still. And any doctor who is worth his salt will tell you that no doctor ever healed anybody. All healing is done by silence. The doctors assist nature and let nature bring about the healing. And just as physical healing and personality healing and psychological healing are brought about through stillness, so spiritual healing also. The greatest killer is guilt. That is the hardest thing to overcome and is the most destructive. And no one ever went around sharing or witnessing to guilt. They all entertain it in silence. You've never heard anyone go about telling you how to achieve a nervous breakdown in 5 easy lessons. No, those things are all secret, held in silence. I have in my diary that was kept way back in 1928, I believe. And it was living the Lord's Prayer for a year, silently, secretly, and yet actively. And in that, I was a nurse. I was a night nurse in the prison hospital. And I had these long shifts at night, 12 hours long. And most of the illnesses in a prison hospital are psychosomatic. They're induced by emotions and by mind. They're mentally and emotionally induced. And most of it is caused by conflict, secretly entertained. There is tremendous guilt in any penal institution. And by this guilt catches up with them and they wind up in the hospital. And many of them die with complications of diseases caused essentially by an unresolved or an unredeemed sense of guilt. And this creates conflict, and the conflict creates confusion and exhaustion and nervousness, and they break down. And these diseases come upon them. Well, during this time that I was practicing the Lord's Prayer, I say this prayer is not to be said, it's to be lived. Now, you can rattle this prayer off in 1 minute, and often it's done, but it'll take you at least a year to really live it. The first 6 months I spent on only 2 words, Our Father. The first 2 words in the Lord's Prayer I tried to live with and apply and integrate and assimilate those 2 words. Our Father. Because it meant the great division in all the religions of the world. God had broken into the world as a personal Father. And it was up to me to personalize God. For the only person that God can have anymore is the person we are. We are here to individualize God and personalize God and embody God in us, or to become the temples of the living Spirit. Well, now that was some chore for me, to get such a personal view of God as a Father, that I could eventually, through practice and application, personalize him to the extent that I felt that I was personalizing him and individualizing him and actually embodying him. It took 6 months for those first 2 words. During that process, I was dealing with many, many men with great compassion, because I was dealing with the greatest prayer in the world. This prayer, when lived, always releases compassion. And compassion is the power that heals the thing that needs to be healed. Compassion is a secret, silent outflowing from the center fund of the soul, where Christ dwells and touches those in need. There was a man there who was so silent that they called him the silent parson. People without joy are silent people. People who have no sense of humor are silent. That is why inmates in penal institutions of all kinds have no humor. There's no use to go and tell jokes to them. They don't understand. It's awfully hard to make them laugh. I remember doing it only once. I've tried a lot. Up in Massachusetts in Walpole last winter, I was speaking in the intermediate reformatory there. It's really a prison. And I told this story about my prison days. I said a grand lady came to visit the prison, And she was surprised at everything. She had expected to see possibly monkeys instead of men. At every place her escort took her, she registered great surprise. Finally, they got into the mess hall, and she discovered that they had knives and forks and a spoon. And she said with great outburst of surprise in a rather enthusiastic way, "Why, my, they even have knives and forks with which to eat." And a very sardonic old burglar sitting on the end of the line right beside her looked up and said, "Yes, lady, we even have teeth in here." And they laughed at that. Well, this man was called the Silent Parson because he had been a minister of the gospel. And he was in there for life. He got into a triangle love affair. And he killed a man in the hope of winning that man's wife and getting a divorce from his own wife. They gave him life, and there he was. Now, he came into the hospital with a multitude of diseases. And the doctor said to me, "This man is a victim of his thoughts and emotions. There isn't anything organically wrong with him, yet he has asthma terribly. And he has very bad kidneys. And actually, his pancreas is going dead. Yet there is no organic cause that can be found by diagnosis here." So he said, "Find out what he's thinking about. And after you find out, let me know." So I had him through the nights. He was brought in there to die. And one of the first things he said to me was that he wanted to die. He didn't want to live. And we talked through the long nights as time would allow, and I got the sad and tragic story of his life. He had married shortly. Well, he wasn't through seminary when he married. He was through college. He married a fine girl, and she worked and helped him through his seminary work. And then they were married, and he went into the ministry, and he became very popular as a preacher. The congregation loved him. And his wife seemed to become less popular, for she gave him 3 children, and her time was pretty well taken up. She allowed herself to be neglectful of herself. She began to be nervous at his popularity. He was always surrounded by women. It seemed as though they were drawn to it. And she began secretly to resent this and to become careless in her appearance. She began to nag and fret and worry until eventually he was unfaithful. And the minute he was unfaithful, he went home, and her sensitivities had been sharpened to a razor edge, and she sensed it. And while she couldn't prove anything, no evidence. There was a great pall of silence fell between them. She couldn't accuse him. And all he could do was to feel her hurt. He had wounded the greatest thing in the world, love. And she knew it. And so he recklessly went on, trying to overcome the terrible guilt. He recklessly plunged into temptation and secret sin. And eventually, he became overwhelmed by a terrible infatuation for one woman. And this led on and on until there was the desire to eliminate his wife and the responsibilities and obligations of his children and to get out of the ministry and to marry this woman. And it led on into the crime of dispatching her husband and getting him out of the way so that it could finally be done, and that is what he did, and he was in there for murder. And here he was in a hospital bed, suffering with all these diseases. And every one of them had been brought about by silently entertaining guilt that he couldn't get rid of. I said to him, God has forgiven you. He said, I know that God has forgiven me for murder, and I've forgiven myself for that, because that was done in the heat of passion. I had no control over it. But he said, I don't believe God has forgiven me for being unfaithful to my vows of marriage. And I have been unable to forgive myself. And I want to die. Well, I said, if you want to die, why don't you die? But die differently. There's nothing for you. There's nothing but eternal hell and damnation as far as you're concerned. There's no salvation. You can't forgive yourself, neither can God forgive you. So you're entering into eternal damnation. Or if you could forgive yourself, God could forgive you, and you could enter into eternal salvation. Now, if you want to die, you can die and still live here. Since there isn't any hope for you anyway, and insofar as you're concerned, you're dead, why don't you just spend the rest of your life assuming that you can live the life laid down by the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament? Why don't you just, since there is no hope, why don't you just surrender to Christ and assume that he will allow you to surrender to him and that he will give you the power to discipline your life according to every principle in the Sermon on the Mount. And see by and by if you cannot be actually crucified with Christ. And I talked to him along that line. I would quote St. Paul, I die daily, said St. Paul. I think he died hourly. That is what life is, a perpetual process of dying to self. And Paul could say, for me to live is Christ, I am dead. I am crucified with Christ. For me to die is gain. And I talked to him. I knew I was going to have him there many, many nights, and I just kept talking about dying. And telling him to assume that he could live the great laws and commandments and principles as put down in the Sermon on the Mount, that he could assume that he did love everybody in that institution, including all the officials, and that if he had any enemies, he could love them with goodwill. I told him to assume that if anybody reviled him, he could love them back. That if anybody hurt him, he would hurt not back again. That if anybody cursed him, he would not curse them back. Just assume that you can do this and see if the power comes for you to do it. And by he began to try it. He was made fun of by lots of people because he was an ex-minister. Many of the prisoners didn't like ex-ministers. You know, in the underworld, they sicken at each other's crimes if they don't have Christ. There's never any judgment so severe as in the underworld. They judge each other terribly. Certain groups in this category of crime over here will have nothing to do with groups in another category of crime. And ministers who have gotten tangled up in crime, they're just ostracized. And so he had a lot of unfriendly inmates around him. And they did call him all manner of things. They did curse him. They did accuse him of everything. They sat in severe judgment upon him, and he knew it, and he knew many of them who were doing it, and he began to try to love these prisoners and to express goodwill toward them. And eventually, as he applied these disciplines secretly and silently within himself, telling no man, he noticed that he was being changed. He was coming out of old attitudes into new beatitudes. The old life was undergoing a slow, gradual, but very subtle change. Until eventually there came a night and I was able to sit down on the edge of his bed, put my arm around his shoulder and asked, "Can't you forgive yourself?" And he relaxed and slumped against me and said, "Yes, I do." And in that moment, he experienced a resurrection. His physical healing came very fast because he was healed spiritually. And the minute he was able to forgive himself, God forgave him. There is nothing impossible with God. When a person sets up on the inside of his mind an idea that God will not forgive him because of the terrible sins he's committed, it is pure, it is an exercise of pure religious pride and pure spiritual egotism. The commandment is that we've got to love the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength, and love our neighbors and ourselves. We've got to forgive ourselves. For the forgiveness of God cannot reach anyone who still entertains secretly a sense of guilt, a sense of inner conflict, a sense of grief, sense of a desire for self-punishment, sense of rejection. He can't reach through and forgive so long as those things are on the inside secretly entertained. And so he wants us to forgive so that he can forgive. Not only forgive ourselves, but to forgive our neighbors. Forgiveness is a tremendous thing, and it's usually a silent, secret, interior ministry. I believe that we should entertain Grief when we lose someone who is dear to us, but not over long. I believe that we ought to be sorry and have sorrow when someone who is near and dear to us has passed on. But if this is prolonged, it becomes egotism. It becomes spiritual pride. And we assume that we have the right to do this to ourselves. In other words, we assume the authority of God. And God's commandment is you must stop doing this and go to loving yourself as you love your neighbor. And that means you've got to forgive yourself so that I can love you and forgive you. I was in a Methodist school for Christian workers, and there was a girl there who wouldn't forgive herself. And I could hardly blame her. And she wouldn't forgive another person, and I could hardly blame her for that. But she was all the time crying all night. Then she'd use all kinds of stuff on her eyes in the morning to kind of smear over the bulges, make them look natural. But everybody, all the students there knew that she was worried about something. And I was talking around there about love all the time. And I didn't have a regular audience. The reason why I was there, because there was one professor there trying to explode the miracles of Jesus. And the professor of church history brought me down there to explode his explosions. He said, I can't guarantee you an audience, but I never even catch anyone preach. So I would get around in every parlor and every room I could stick my nose into, and they put me up in the bishop's chamber. I was there a whole week, and I kept going around talking about love. And the students would gather around and sit on the floor in the parlors and discuss and talk. And this girl kept hanging around, and I wondered why she kept following around. And one morning she said to me, I'm getting sick of that love stuff that you're preaching. Well, I said, if you're sick of it, why are you hanging around it? The next time I had a meeting, there she was again. And finally I said to her, what's the matter with you anyway? I just don't understand why you dislike love so much. What are you doing in here trying to get prepared for what? What are you in this place for? And she said she was going to be a missionary to the hill people, the submarginal people in the hills, the sharecroppers. I said, how are you going to do that if you can't love? If you go up there and try to serve those people without love, they'll wear you out. They'll take everything you can give them. No one will love you back. You'll wind up a decrepit, disillusioned, cynical old woman by and by and chucked off in some missionary home where there's nothing but cold charity. Well, she said, I'm going to tell you something. And she really meant it. She said, what would you do if you were brought up and went to school with a boy, grew into young womanhood and young manhood with him, and when he was around 19 years of age, The two families visited back and forth together, and he rode his bike around the house as he'd done 100 times before, and went into the kitchen, and your mother took out the butcher knife or the cake knife and got out the cake and carved him a slice of cake as she'd done many times. And then he grabbed the knife out of her hand and hacked her to death on the kitchen floor. What would you do? Boy, I'm telling you, that was something. What would I do? What would I do? And that happened to her. And the young man was in the penitentiary and he had life. And the commission of doctors had declared him sane. And he seemingly had no motive, just as thousands of kids now have no motives for the senseless crimes they're committing. They just do it. And she said, as long as I'm living and as long as he's living, I'm going to keep him right there. And she said, I'll never forgive him to the end of my days. Well, what would I do? I wouldn't know. I would only know this, that I'd have to forgive him. I'd have to love him. And if I couldn't forgive him and couldn't love him, I would pack up my bag and get out of that religious school. Because the only thing that could happen to me if I lived there with this unforgiveness and unlove in my heart would be to destroy myself. The chickens would come home to roost. You can't cheat God. She was probably in that place training herself to be a certain kind of missionary with the idea that exercising this duty without love, she could in some way or other curry God's favor, and that he would soothe this spirit of unforgiveness. But you can't do it. Duty is as cold as a fish out of fresh water. There is nothing redemptive in it unless there is love in it. You cannot curry God's favor except through love. You must obey those great commandments. And whatever we do, says St. Paul, let it be done with love. That's his command. Let it be done with love. And I said to her, I believe I know that I would have to forgive him. And if I were you, and you've made up your mind that you do not intend to or do not want to, might I give you some advice that is based upon terrible experience, and that is that you pack your bags today and leave. Don't pretend. Don't be sham, be a sham. You can't be a sham with God. And I said, I will do this. If you will go into that chapel, I will do with you just exactly what they did in apostolic times. They tarried with people in need in those days, and you're in great need. And I will go in there in that chapel, and we'll face that altar and kneel on those flagstones in there, and we'll stay there until you forgive or we starve to death or perish right there. And she slept over it and cried all night. Next morning she came and said, I don't feel any different. But she said, I'm willing to go into the chapel. I said, all right, let's go. And I wished later that I hadn't have been so daring in my desire to help. Those flagstones were